Hi, I'm Dave Kahle. Welcome to this Christian Business Insights podcast show where my goal is to provide you with practical, actionable ideas to help you create businesses and careers of excellence and at the same time multiply your influence for the kingdom. I have been a Christian in business for over 30 years, and I have personally and contractually consulted with over 500 different sales organizations. So in these podcasts, I combine the lessons that I have learned with an out-of-the-box experience and perspective on Christianity that you will find challenging. And we put that together to provide you with practical insights and ideas that you can use to live better and lead better. Hi, this is Dave. I got a special treat for you today. I have an author and former Benedictine monk, Doug Lyman, and we're going to learn a lot about money from Doug. So, Doug, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, well, my resume looks like it was designed by Salvador Dali on a sugar high. So I was started off. Grew up in a fairly wealthy family where money was weaponized, and so I rebelled against that world first by joining the Marine Corps, and I went to officer candidate school and graduated at the top of my class, and then had a bit of a spiritual awakening and decided to leave the Marines, and then became a Benedictine monk for 20 years
Mm.
to try and escape the world of money and materialism forever. It was also a great way to flabbergast my parents. But then in an ironic twist of fate, our monastic community went bankrupt a few years after I joined. So then I had to take on the responsibility for sorting out the community finances. And then over time, and so I had a really good run as a monk, but then over time, I decided to leave the world of monasticism to become a professional money manager and take the skills that I learned out into the world and help teach people how to have a healthier, more ethical relationship to money. And I was a partner at an asset management firm where I helped oversee about $250 million in assets. And now I'm a professional speaker, writer, and coach. And my first book is called From Monk to Money Manager, a former monk's financial guide to becoming a little bit wealthy and why that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And my newest book, which releases July 8th, is called Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. And so the first book, From Monk to Money Manager, is kind of a how-to book to, the nuts and bolts of managing your finances. And this newest book is really a why-do book, why we make sort of packed with spiritual and psychological insights using this cool system called the Enneagram to help you understand why you kind of have these different money monsters that might be sabotaging your financial life and how to overcome them to become a true money master.
Mm. Lots of good stuff there, Doug. It's really impressive. So, Benedictine monk. Let's talk about that first. Uh, what prompted you to be one? What prompted you to not be one?
Well,
What
those are
about the
big questions.
transitions there, beginning and ending?
Well, when I was in the Marines, I sort of realized that high explosives and unresolved anger issues were probably a bad combination. So running around blowing people up around the world wasn't probably the best life decision I could be making, although I loved my time in the Marines and respect them immensely.
Hmm.
And so I kind of went searching for a higher calling. What could be something that would give me everything I loved about the Marines, the esprit de corps, the camaraderie, the community, the sense of purpose. And I was also sort of really reacting against this sort of kind of toxic materialism world that I grew up in. And I also had this sort of real spiritual kind of, I always had a deep spiritual quest that I kind of have been on my entire life. And I had a really good mentor in college who suggested that I might try monasticism. It might be a monastic life might be something that I was really looking for. So I decided to give it a shot. Initially, it was just sort of like a fun experiment. I thought it was going to be like graduate school and I would do it for a few years and then move on to something else. But I actually kind of fell in love with the lifestyle and the community and really enjoyed it for the most part. But after 20 years, it became a little bit stifling. It was good for the earlier part of my life, but by the end, it kind of became a bit like a bad marriage where
Hmm.
you think it's going to get better, but it kind of isn't. And monasticism is really dying across the globe. I mean, communities are closing left and right because
Hmm.
they're sort of aging out. I was the youngest monk by 30 years, and so
Oh,
after a while, it became more hospice care, so to speak, than
yeah.
than real and anything else. And so I realized that this community was dying, and it wasn't really going to be sustainable long term. So I needed to find another path for my life.
Hmm.
And finance was sort of an obvious choice because I was good at it.
Hmm.
My service in the community, like all the monks, we all kind of had a different niche that we filled. And of course, I was the business manager eventually for the community. And my form of service is really helping monastery guests with their financial problems. They would come to us and say, come to me and say, well, would you pray for me? And I'd be like, okay, of course, I'm happy to pray for you. But, building a budget might actually be more effective in helping you with some of your problems because I realized that a lot of our spiritual problems are often financial problems in disguise or have some financial component to them, where if you can resolve that issue and resolve that financial stress that people are under, a lot of their sort of existential angst will evaporate.
Hmm. So, this whole thing of finances and money is something that I've always been interested in. I've often thought that, at some point I've made career decisions, and one of them was to be in sales and eventually become, a sales guru. But I thought, if I didn't do that, what I would probably do is be a financial guy. I'd get
Uh-huh.
involved in finance because I've always dabbled in it. We
Uh-huh.
had when I had a staff and all that. I had we had our SEPs and retirement accounts and so on. And I did all the investing for those
Mhm.
accounts for a number of years. So I got to the point where eventually I just said, this is too much. I mean, you can just get sucked into that world really, really deeply.
Mhm.
But you made a comment about money, making money, and it's okay to make money. I'm paraphrasing now.
Yeah.
Defend that, because so I have listeners. I am sure there are some listeners out there who believe it's money isn't a good thing; it's a necessary evil. And there are others who believe, and this is pretty common, and that is the purpose of a Christian business is to make money to give it to the institutional church system.
Mhm.
Both of those I find fault with, but let me hear
Sure.
your perspective. So, is it okay to make money?
Of course.
Yes.
So money is, to, I would be, if I could describe my life journey with sort of two bookends. I
Hmm.
sort of started off with this belief that, the love of money is the root of all evil. Of course, if you look into that quote by St. Paul, if you dig into the Greek, the word love has many multiple meanings in Greek that it doesn't have the nuances in
Hmm.
English that it does in the original. So
Hmm.
there's multiple ways of understanding love, as Christians will know. There's agape and there's philios, and then what Paul is talking about is sort of this sort of more materialistic base love of money versus a higher agape form of love of money, which is what I'm trying to get people towards.
Hmm.
But I think I'm now more from going from that misunderstanding, I think, of that quote in my early years to really what Mark Twain humorously said is that the lack of money is the root of all evil.
Hmm.
What it comes down to is the beautiful truth is that money is just a tool, like a hammer. You can
Hmm.
use it to build something beautiful or whack yourself on the thumb. And the choice is really ours how we're going to use it. And it's really about finding a balance in your life between these two extremes. And I think what monasticism really taught me is what we call mystical thinking, which is avoided putting things in these simple black or white categories where everything's all good or all bad or all this or
Yes.
all that, where things are a little bit more fuzzy around the edges and maybe much more beautiful and more grander than that. And to realize that there's no like there's no correlation between you being a good person and your tax bracket. Like there isn't this be a decent human switch that flips on or off depending on the size of your bank account.
Hmm.
And so you can find wonderful people who are very wealthy using their tools, using their wealth as a tool for love and service to a suffering world. And you can find, of course, rich people who are doing just the opposite. And the same thing is true on the other end of the spectrum. Just because you're poor doesn't make you a more virtuous person. And
Hmm.
and anyone who thinks that it's kind of this weird idea that like either rich people are all good or bad, or poor people are all good or bad. It's just sort of a silly dichotomy that I think we need to get ourselves out of that trap.
Hmm. Good. So, what's your premise? I mean, have you got a theme in the book, a premise on which the whole thing is based?
Well, yeah, this new book, Taming Your Money Monster, is really based on this personality system called the Enneagram.
Hmm.
And for those listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's this very robust personality system with 9 distinct personality archetypes.
Hmm.
And it's like kind of like getting the user's manual for your ego, teaching you how to drive it with a little bit more skill and grace. And maybe try if I could give you just kind of a quick explanation for how it works. It's a very complicated system, and I'll try to make it as simple as I can. But your Enneagram, if you think of like your Enneagram type like a vehicle or the car that you drive, and so your car is unique. You drive a unique year, make, and model that's distinct from every other car on the road. But there are patterns for, it's like there's patterns for cars, there's patterns for egos.
Hmm.
And so your Enneagram type was chosen in childhood as the perfect coping mechanism to whatever the biggest threats were that you faced in your childhood environment. And so it was your psyche's brilliant solution and strategy to adapt and survive. And now your personality, though, it has 2 components. It's got your nature or your DNA, and then it's got your nurture or how you were raised. And so the Enneagram is really talking about just the nurture part of your personality.
Hmm.
And here's the really fascinating part, and it gets a little technical, but you have to imagine that, so when you were born, there was a physical umbilical cord that was cut,
Hmm.
but you immediately developed a psychological umbilical cord that connected you to your caregivers. And it allowed them to do most of the driving for you in the early years of your life. So you're creating this sort of egoic codependency on your caregivers.
Hmm.
But that psychological umbilical cord also had to be cut, but by negative emotions, because positive emotions would just reinforce your connection to your caregivers. And so we know from the recent neurobiological research that that psychological umbilical cord could only be cut by one of what we call the big 3 negative emotions,
Okay.
which is anger,
Hmm.
sadness, or fear.
Hmm.
And so that gives us sort of we call them the 3 triads of the. So we've got these 9 types. If you put them on like a think of a color wheel, right?
Okay.
If you could take that color wheel and divide it up into 9 pie slices,
Hmm.
that's kind of where your kind of your what color you are kind of determines where you land on that system.
Hmm.
And so there's the anger, fear, and sadness triads, and then we're going to break each of those down into 3 subsections because this anger, sadness, and fear could only be processed. That pain from that emotion could only be processed in one of 3 ways. You can either externalize it, which is like kind of like having a food fight with the world.
Hmm.
You can internalize it, which is kind of like giving yourself an emotional wedgie, or you can do both. So there's these 3 core negative emotions and 3 ways to process each of them, which gives us these 9 archetypal patterns of personality. So
And
that's a
okay,
mhm.
how do those 9 patterns relate to money?
Okay. Well, this is again, it's quite. We're gonna get into the weeds here a little bit,
Okay. It's
but what I've
okay.
done is I've layered on top of this system what I call the attachment theory of money,
Okay.
which for anyone who's familiar with the attachment theory of relationships, it's almost identical to it. But if you're not familiar with it, what the attachment theory of money says is that there's just these 2 unhealthy ways that we can relate to money. One that's anxiously attached to money, kind of like the Ebenezer Scrooge. They're the folks who are kind of driving their financial life with perpetual road rage and want all the money,
Hmm.
and are really obsessed about it. And then there's those of us who are money avoidant, meaning we unconsciously push money away and hate dealing with it or demonize it or think it's dirty or shameful. And so that creates these what I call 2 money monsters for each of the 9 types. And the book really goes into depth about each of those. And I could walk you through all 9 types if we've got time or however you want to take that.
Well, let's talk. Let's create an example. I mean, have you got a hypothetical person that you can kind of tell us, examine that person and talk about how this
Yeah.
thing works? Yeah.
Well, let's just talk about my type, or
Okay.
it's always a fun one. So um, I'm what's called an Enneagram Type 3,
Okay.
and we call them the achievers.
Okay.
And I use car metaphors. So I call them the race car because
Okay.
we're always speeding towards the next goal, but we're often leaving our authentic selves in the dust. And so the psychological cord cutting that we're talking about, I call that your sacred wound.
Okay.
And so the sacred wound for a type 3 so we're in the sadness triad, meaning that my psychological umbilical cord was cut by sadness that I've internalized,
Mm-hmm.
meaning I feel sad or ashamed about how I perceive myself,
Mm-hmm.
and that I've externalized, meaning I feel sad or ashamed about how I think other people perceive me.
Mm-hmm.
And from that sacred wound, which that psychological umbilical cord being cut, it creates for each of us a unique, I call your greatest fear. So the greatest fear for a type 3 is being worthless.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this deep sense of lack of self-worth or insecurity that we're always trying to assuage by getting the pat in the back, getting the gold scar, winning the race, getting the promotion,
Mm-hmm.
all these sort of external signs of validation to overcome this deep-seated insecurity that we have. And so now there's all these different parts to this, but I'll just jump to the money monsters really quickly, and we can go into more depth if you like. But the money avoidant type 3 is what I call the barrier, meaning our financial life creates so much shame for us that we sort of bury our head in the sands and don't want to look at it, which sends our financial life down the drain. Or we can become money anxious, and I call that the blinger. So the blinger is sort of throws money at status symbols in order to feel important. And so their financial life is more like a Hollywood set. It's beautiful on the outside, but kind of plywood and paint on the inside.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So your focus, nature and nurture, your focus is on nurture, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I reflected my background and childhood. So I was one of six boys.
Hmm.
Yeah. And my father died at a young age. He died when he was 53. And I'm sure that we were instilled in all of us was a sense of independence because each of the six of us at one point in our life all had our own businesses. And
Hmm.
I think that's probably highly unusual. And I think it probably speaks to the environment that our parents fostered as we were growing up. But how would something like that, I mean, how would that relate to what you're talking about here? I mean, I mean, am I being too esoteric here to ask
No,
for,
no,
yeah.
you're right on point. Well, maybe we could try to figure out your type if you want to play a little game with me.
Well, I think I know what my type is, but go ahead. Yeah, let's see if we can.
Oh, well, if you want to tell me, yeah, be save us some time. But here's the question: these are the questions I ask people, and there's a really good test you can take online. It's called the IEQ 9 Integrative Enneagram Test, and I could send you a link to that for your show notes if you're curious. If people want to take this test, it's got a 95% accuracy rate, but kind of doing
Well,
it.
let me stop you right there. Yes, please do send the show notes, and I'll put the link in the show notes so anybody who's listening can check
Mhm.
the show notes, do the link, and take the assessment. Right?
Yep, exactly right.
Okay. Sorry. Go on.
Okay. And so this is sort of a quick hack, which is not going to be as accurate, but we'll try. So the first question I would say is in your darkest emotional moments when things are really bad for you,
Mhm.
which emotion do you tend to feel more of? Is it anger, sadness, which is sometimes experienced as shame, or is it fear?
Sadness.
Sadness.
Yeah.
Okay. So that
Mhm.
would put you in the sadness triad. So then the question is do you, so then there's three possible choices here. So each type has a greatest fear and see
Okay.
which one of these three feels more appropriate to you. So if you externalize that sadness, then you're what we call type 2, the helper. And their greatest fear is that they're unlovable. So they're always kind of running around helping other people to try to uh, earn love and validation.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you?
Not a bit.
Okay.
Okay.
Then we've got the type 4, I'm going to jump to type 4,
Mm-hmm.
and they're what we call, they internalize that sadness. So they feel sad about how, or ashamed about how they perceive themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we call them the individualist. I call them the custom car because they have to be different from everybody else on the road,
Yeah.
even if it means painting their car purple neon and driving backwards. Does that resonate with you at
Yeah,
all?
somewhat. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, so type fours tend to be really creative types, and they tend to be very independent, and kind of a bit of a lone wolf sometimes. Does that feel?
I mean, you got me to a T. I'm all those things. I've authored 14 books.
Uh-huh.
I've been in like every year in my practice, I would consider this option. Should I expand it and be a company, or should I just raise my fees and be an individual? And every year I said I'm going to raise my fees and be an individual. So I,
Hmm.
if you'd ask me just a free flow, those words of individual, creative, maverick, those words would come out of my mouth unprompted. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how I see
Yeah.
myself. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other choice is a type 3, which is my type, which we just covered. So so it sounds like you're a type 4. Is that hit it
Well,
on the nail?
I'm what we just said. I don't know. I didn't. I'm not sure whether it's a 3 or 4, but I am, a maverick,
Yep.
individual, independent. Yep, all those things. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay.
So
So
yeah, so the greatest fear for yeah,
okay.
and the
So how
greatest
does that
fear
relate to
is
money?
is not being
How does that relate to
well,
money?
okay, so if you're a type yeah, so if you're a type 4,
Hmm.
then if you're money avoidant, you're what I call the flop, meaning the type 4s sometimes rebel against the conventionality. So they sometimes find things like budgeting and bookkeeping too pedestrian for their creative minds, which doesn't sound like that's you too much, but maybe it was in your earlier years.
Hmm.
Or they can be what I call the flinger, meaning they really obsess about money, but they can fling it at any form of creativity or self-expression that allows them to stand out and stand apart and feel unique and different.
Hmm. I'm not sure. That's
Or you could be money secure, or you could be money secure, right? You could have a healthy relationship to money. And then the important thing about this theory is that, our financial life has more than one component to it. So
hmm
there's what I call the 4 pillars of finance.
hmm
So the 4 pillars of finance are earning, saving, investing, and giving.
hmm
And a lot of us are sort of jumbled in our attachment style to money. We might be anxious in one area, but avoidant in another. So some people might be an anxious earner, but you might be an avoidant saver, or you might be an anxious investor, but you kind of avoid giving back to your community. So it can show up in different ways
hmm
and at different times depending on the stressors in your life.
hmm Yeah, I think I'm pretty secure as you're describing it when it relates to money. Um, we'll see, but that's my feeling. Anyway, um, how does this concept and the tools and techniques and things that you develop, how does that relate to an individual? Let's do two different people here. I'm a white collar Christian professional.
And I'm sorry, Dave, my internet just glitched for a minute.
Yeah, I
I got
saw
cut
I
out
saw
there
that.
for
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's see how this can relate to individuals. And so I'm one of two people here listening. I'm a one person is I'm a white collar Christian professional, and I've got
Mhm.
I'm a professional, or maybe I've got a business, or maybe I work in a business at some level. How does what you're saying have anything to do with me?
Oh, well, a lot because 'cause once you understand your Enneagram type, it's going to help you understand how you relate to everything, including money and your finances. So it could tell you where you can identify where you might tend to struggle in your financial life. But it's also really helpful for team building. So understanding the Enneagram type of the members of your team and in your business and in your community can really help you pinpoint their strengths and weaknesses.
Hmm.
So for example, if someone's a type 2 and they're a helper, they may be a, they would the kind of person you would want to put in a kind of customer service role in a public facing position
Hmm.
because they have this natural drive to be helpful and be of service to others.
Mhm.
Whereas, for example, there's the Enneagram Type 5, which is a kind of a very reserved, kind of the brainiac. They're going to be better at a number crunching kind of position, sitting behind a desk or dealing something with much more technical
Mhm.
and more data analytic.
Mhm.
They tend to be very cold and reserved, and probably not the kind of person you want in that sort of public facing role necessarily. Although so there's different strengths and weaknesses that they're going to bring to your business and to your team, and knowing where people are going to find it what's easier for them and what's harder for them in general, but also then in terms of how they're relating to the money and the
Mhm.
part of the business.
Mhm. Well, I think what you're saying has application to almost anybody. I'm wondering, is there
Mhm.
specific application for a Christian?
Well, yes. Okay, so the Enneagram is a very spiritual system. So here's a way to think about it. It's sort of like the physics of consciousness, and I like to kind of think of it as the underlying operating system for all of our spiritual practices, because um, what the Enneagram does is it tells you what your shadow side is of your personality. What are the sort of the darker, more challenging parts of your personality? And then it offers a spiritual path to wholeness and growth of how do we overcome these money monsters and these
Mhm.
darker parts of our personality. And so it's almost like all of our religions are different apps running on the same cosmic smartphone, and that there's this underlying code baked into reality that shapes how the human ego is formed, and then what the now um, in the traditional Enneagram system, we often talk about like your greatest, each type has a what we call a passion, or what's your greatest vice or sin that you're
Yeah.
most likely to fall into.
Mhm.
And so, you talk about the seven deadly sins, and actually they missed two and added two more later on. But that those deadly sins are the kind of the deepest. Each Enneagram type has one of those problems that they
Mhm.
have to really struggle with more than other types. So you see someone, for example, really struggling with lust, but that might not be my problem, but that's something someone else really has to deal with. Or dishonesty is something another type might have more struggle with,
Mhm.
whereas others might deal with envy or anger. So the Enneagram really tells you what that spiritual cross is that you're most likely to have to hang on, and
Mhm.
then how you're going to find that spiritual path to wholeness and fulfillment.
Mhm. So again, let's say I'm a CEO of a small company, or I'm a executive, or maybe I'm a sales professional and so on, and I'm interested in growing and learning as much as I can. What does this book have to say to me that's going to give me an action plan? If I want to walk away with a one-page action plan, what's
Yep.
the plan? How
Okay.
would I get to the plan? Maybe that's a better question.
Sure. So actually, I have what I've for each Enneagram type, I've created what I call an ego map. So this book is packed full of really helpful charts. And so the action plan for your type is like right there on the first page for the chapter for your type. And it's going to detail step by step the shadow structure of your ego, and which has about six different parts to it, and how they work and how they're going to trip you up and how they're most likely to show up and potentially derail your personal life and your financial life.
Hmm.
And then there's an equal kind of ladder up uh, into your what I call your enlightenment structure,
Okay.
which is then your path to spiritual wholeness. And the journey looks a little bit like this. If I could just give you the quick ego map for all of the
Mhm.
types, the kind of rough outline
Mhm.
is you have to think of, I've created this new model for the Enneagram, which is it's a double cone. And so if you think of like two traffic cones that you kind of stick together at their bases,
Mhm.
at the bottom of that cone is sort of the beginning of your journey in life.
Okay.
And so you have to imagine what it was like when you were in your mother's womb, and sort of like the Edenic state before the metaphorical fall, so to speak, before you were born. And in that state, the basic axiom of the system is that you were in a state of unconscious unity, meaning you were in a state of oneness with everything you could experience, but
Mhm.
you didn't have a clear sense of self, so you were unconscious.
Mhm.
But then you get born, and there's this psychological umbilical cord that forms that we talked about. But then that has to be cut. But then your ego grows as you're moving up the bottom half of this double cone. And what you're doing, and this is like what we call the first half of life, and this is your path to independence, or what I call your journey from thee to me. So your journey from your divine origin into an individuated sense of self. And that creates a sense of conscious separation. So you're trying to become conscious and have a separate, unique identity in the world. But the problem with our egos is that they keep growing. They keep growing, but they don't know when to stop.
Mm.
And eventually they grow so strong and so big, it's almost like a blowfish that we're sort of puffed up so much that we tend to push away our what I call our ego addictions. We have these different addictions that each of our egos are attached to that drive us into the dark night of the soul, this sort of deep existential crisis that we almost all of us hit at some point. It can come quickly, it can come slowly, but there's usually some tragedies or often self-created suffering because of our ego addictions that make us then feel separate from everyone and everything else, including our sense of the divine. And then what has to happen in that dark night of the soul is our egos have to break open and find more compassion and kindness and love and connection. And then our ego starts to recede a little bit as we move up into our enlightenment structure, which then brings us to the top of this double cone, which would be conscious unity, which is, I think, is the spiritual goal we're all striving towards, is that sense of oneness with all of reality and God.
Mhm.
But there's a distinct path that each of us had a different path that each of us is going to take through that lifetime journey. And the action plan is going to be really detailed and laid out for you in this book.
Wow, good stuff. So,
Mhm.
so what's the name of the book, and where can we get it?
The book is Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. And
Okay,
it's available from retailers everywhere beginning July 8th
okay,
in just a few weeks.
okay. And if someone wanted to get a hold of you, is there a way that they could do that?
Yep, you can find me on my website at douglynam.com. That's DOUGLYN as in Nicholas,
Mhm.
AM as in Michael.com.
Very good stuff. Any parting shots, Doug? Any last words you have for my listeners here? You know, I'm always amazed at how sophisticated I guess our psyches are, and the degree to which it fits into an even more sophisticated world and an even more I mean, there are layers and layers of understanding in terms of spirituality that we just have not even touched, you know.
Right.
So I think you've got another view into that world, and it's
Mhm.
helpful. So any last thoughts you have?
Yeah, I hope people will check it out. And I think you know, I think there's some really groundbreaking ideas that your readers will find exciting and engaging. So anybody who really wants to understand how their mind works
Hmm.
and where your stumbling blocks are likely to be, I think you're going to find this book really helpful and insightful. And that the point is to get people to become a money master, right? Who then can use their wealth as a tool for love and service to a suffering world.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we're thanks. We're gonna call it a day here. That's it. We're done. Bye bye.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Be well.